back, everyone. This is Radio Free Market. I'm your host, Michael McKay, and we're talking with Dr. Thomas DiLorenzo on how capitalism saved America, which is actually the title of his excellent book, which I recommend to everyone to buy and read. Tom, I wanted to ask, we were just talking about the concept of government helping various businesses via protectionist methods. Is this why large corporations support big government so they can squash competition?
Sure. It's not only large corporations. There are a lot of smaller corporations, too. I mean, we have the Small Business Administration, which is dispenses corporate welfare to relatively small businesses. And, of course, since they can't give corporate welfare to every single small business, they necessarily play favors and skew competition in favor of the ones who are lucky enough to get government favors. So it's not just big business. But the genesis of this was in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was big businesses that actually advocated and lobbied for many of the government regulatory agencies that were created supposedly to protect the consumer. The very first was the Interstate Commerce Commission that was formed in 1887 that was supposed to regulate the railroads for the benefit of the consumer. But the first head of the Interstate Commerce Commission was the president of a railroad corporation. And then, of course, what they ended up doing was establishing monopoly prices for railroads. And then when we had the Federal Trade Commission, the Food and Drug Administration, what the big corporations figured out was they were for these things because they thought that these regulatory agencies could impose onerous costs on their smaller competitors and form what economists call barriers to entry or barriers to competition. And so big business especially has always been in favor of using big government for its own benefit. And that, of course, is what old Adam Smith, the British philosopher, criticized in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, that was published in 1776, the year of the American Revolution. And things haven't changed a heck of a lot since then. They're still at it, trying to use big government as a tool to thwart competition.
Go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, well, just keeping on that point, you've made a distinction between two types of entrepreneurs, market entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs. What exactly is the difference between these two?
Well, a market entrepreneur is somebody who makes money by producing goods and services that are of good quality and competitive prices on the marketplace. A political entrepreneur is someone who's in business who makes money by trying to influence politics in a way that laws or regulations are passed that either sends taxpayer subsidies their way, bailouts, for example, or laws or regulations that are harmful to the competition, or at least more harmful to the competition than they are to them. That gives them an advantage. And sometimes in history there have been business people who were market entrepreneurs in the early part of their career, and then they became political entrepreneurs later. So it's not a clear-cut division. But in my book, I write about how the transcontinental railroads that were built in the 19th century. There was one market entrepreneur named James J. Hill who built a transcontinental without any government subsidies, no land grants, no cash subsidies, and he outcompeted all the government-subsidized railroads that were given, many, many millions of dollars worth of free land and low-interest loans from the government. And they were much more inefficient because they were controlled by politics and not by market considerations. And so that's the difference between market entrepreneurs and political entrepreneurs. Bill Gates, his big problem with the government was he was too much of a market entrepreneur for the first years of his company. That's why the government ended up suing him, and nothing much came of the lawsuit. But they harassed him for about 10 years with investigations, and then filed a lawsuit, and then eventually hardly anything came of it. But it diverted his attention and his efforts for more than a decade away from producing products for his company toward dealing with politics. And then, sure enough, after that happened, he established the Washington Law Office and started bribing politicians like everybody else does. And now he plays the political entrepreneur game, although he was almost thoroughly a market entrepreneur earlier in his career.
Very fascinating, very fascinating. So, Drew, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I guess going back, even like, back to the Industrial Revolution towards the early 1800s, most people primarily lived on farms, but due to advances in agricultural technology, it became possible for people to leave the farm and work in the city. Today, however, many socialists and other people claim that working environment in the factories was nasty, brutish, and unsafe. But how did it compare to the pre-capitalist conditions out in the farm?
Well, I think a good way to judge that is that looking at how people voluntarily left the farm and went to the factories. And the early factories were not playgrounds. By today's standards, they were dirtier and dangerous than most jobs that Americans have today. But if you see people by the thousands leaving the farms and moving to factories, you have to assume that they must have figured that it was in their own best interest to do that, and that they were improving their lives. After all, back-breaking farm labor for 12, 14, or 16 hours a day for very low pay was not a walk in the park either. And so to a lot of people, leaving that was very welcomed relief. And besides that, they got paid more. And because of all the capital investment by American entrepreneurs during the Industrial Revolution, American labor became more and more productive and better paid. And so it was a great thing for the American standard of living to and that same type of capital.
Okay, so Tom, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're going to take another break, and so please stay with us. This is Radio Free Market. We'll be right back.